Michel Bauwens, welcome to Radio Wolf. I'm happy to talk to you again.
Yes, hello, Thomas. It's good to see you again after, I think, 3 years.
Yes. You are a very well-known author, writer, and speaker about peer-to-peer technology, commons, and the whole take of a different economic possibility for our global markets. And we would like to talk with you about the new technological developments that we have right now with blockchain and decentralized autonomous organizations. As I just told you, we wrote in our German magazine a whole issue about that, how this is or is not a potential for creating conscious networks, conscious decentralized and autonomous networks around the world, or if this is a new technological kind of utopia that kind of will create the opposite of what it promises. And as you are kind of thinking about these kind of topics since decades, are you hopeful? Do you think about blockchain? I mean, there are obviously difficulties, challenges all around it, but do you think there is a real potential that we should think and talk about?
So, to be totally honest, in the short term, I am not optimistic. I think we are living in a time of accelerated decline, and it's ecological decline. So, resource depletion and climate change. It's social injustice and precarity. So we are reaching levels of insecurity that create free-floating anxiety in people. So we are in the midst of a crisis of polarization and fragmentation. So these are already two serious issues. And then the third issue is, I think the issue of mediation, mediation between humans and nature, right? So these are like different trends that are for the moment going in the negative direction. And I think if you look at human history, you can see this happening regularly. Civilizations decline and collapse and lead to new situations. And just in the West, we have a very big change, in the 5th century with the collapse of the Roman Empire. Then we have the religious civil war in the 15th century that is devastating and leads to capitalism and the nation state. And so I think very much we're in the similar situation, right? Mm-hmm. So we are in a situation where I think the social dislocation and the cultural dislocation is preceding even physical. It's going faster than even physical issues. So in that sense, I'm not optimistic like in the short term. I think we have to brace ourselves. But I think also these are the periods where the new is being born, right? So it's in those moments that, so basically what I see is an enormous, so there's too much differentiation, and technology is a cause of that, right? So you could, I'm not sure what it was at the end of Roman Empire, but the expansion of the empire, the mixing of peoples, the depopulation of Italy. So all this created incapacity of the empire to manage its complexity, and it went back to a much simpler social order, which was the feudal and the Christian dogmas for a time. It got a more beautiful phase afterwards, but certainly the first few centuries, it was a huge simplification and die out of the population. Then in the 15th century, despite all my critics of the capitalist system, I actually think that we created more complexity. So in other words, it was relatively successful because we privatized religion. So we didn't have to fight physically around religion anymore. We could have it as a private opinion. And then we created this kind of civic religion around the monarch and then the nation state and democracy that created peace. And so this is a similar crisis. So personally, I don't think we can avoid technology. I think humanity is a technological species. That's how we became human, by actually creating tools and improving them. And so to me, like, a purely like, retro-romantic vision of let's go back to how it was, to more simple. So personally, I don't think this is interesting. So the way I see technology is, is that we have to somehow take control of it again, right? So we have created all these layers of mediation, and I agree with the critics that we have reached a level of alienation with ecology, with nature, with animals that is actually increased with the kind of technology we have today. But rather than say let's undo it, which I don't think it's possible. I don't think humanity is ready to give up the access to knowledge and to global cooperation that we have achieved. So I think like it's a bit like high tech, high touch, right? So it's a paradox. It's precisely because we have this technology that is so mediated, precisely we have to compensate in the other direction. It's like there is a spiritual teacher, John Heron, he says, it's the same thing. Well, it's not the same thing, but it's by analogy. He says the more you go up, in the mystical experience, the more you have to go down in embodiment, right? So it's the same idea. We are going to this technological level, and that means we have to make extra efforts to reconnect with ecology. And so basically, I would say that in terms of societal program, the welfare state, which we created after World War I and World War II, was the idea, let's make peace between capital and labor, right? Because in many ways, World War I was a struggle between nation states and empires. Austria-Hungary and the Ottoman Empire disappeared, and it actually created the Russian Revolution, and you had revolution in Germany with the Spartacist League and all of that. And so in order to make peace around the struggle, the welfare state was born as a social contract. But the price we paid for the social contract was actually anthropocene. Of course, it started before with the Industrial Revolution, but if you really look at the figures, you can actually see that the hockey stick actually started in the 50s. In other words, at a very precise moment when we created the welfare state is when we start really overusing the planet, for serious, right? And so today I would say that the challenge is a contract with nature. This is the challenge. The challenge is, as we are moving to this planetarization level, this really requires some kind of like agreement with other living beings, with the web of life, right? And so here's the paradox. I do think that technology can play a role. If you don't mind, I'd like to briefly explain this.
Sure.
So basically, the way I see the blockchain, but I would say the post-blockchain, because we have to divorce the idea of a distributed ledger, right, which is a way to open up transactions, to show each other what we're doing. Mm-hmm. But that's what a ledger is. A ledger is an accounting system. And with the digital, we are creating public accounting systems, publicly visible, transparent accounting systems. And so it means in a way that we are shifting from the internet of communication, which was the internet, mm-hmm. to an internet of transactions. And why is this interesting? Because it creates the possibility of ecosystems of collaboration that are non-territorial. So in other words, you can say, okay, we need copper in the world. We can actually have an ecosystem of extraction and use of copper that is shared and is visible, and we can integrate in those structures a consciousness of natural limits, right? And so we have new forms of accounting like contributory accounting, impact accounting. We have intelligent cryptocurrencies like Fishcoin, which tell you how much fish, you can fish without destroying the reproduction of the fish. We have flow accounting, which is like 3D accounting. It doesn't use double entry. It actually shows for every, it's called resources, events, actions. And so every action is like 3D. You see your place in the ecology. Mm-hmm. Okay, so that's my argument. My argument is that the blockchain represents a cyber physical infrastructure for global cooperation that would allow for the production of human needs within planetary boundaries. So to make visible context-based sustainability at every level of action. So in other words, it actually creates a possibility to introduce consciousness, maybe not the consciousness that we are talking now as human beings, but kind of the awareness of the impact of our actions, right? So it's a way of formalizing this kind of contract with nature in our daily tools. And I think this is a huge, potentially important tool. And just to finish, and then I will give more details about this. The way to solve the conundrum is something I call cosmo-localization. So I can talk about it later, but this is very important. It's what we need to do now is to connect in the right way the local and the non-local. Because civilization was 5,000 years ago a way to organize land, the town and the country, right? That's what civilization was about. It's to organize the agriculture of civilization. And now we are creating a layer of the noosphere, a layer of human cooperation, of human, like interconnected brain cooperation that creates a non-territorial virtual sphere and virtual communities, people organizing themselves non-territorial. And the big challenge is going to be, how do we put both of these together?
Oh, thank you for this run through the territory. As I understand it, one way to kind of talk in a different way about the argument that you brought, that cryptocurrency is kind of a currency that you can build in human intelligence that's more than just abstract market value. So you can bring different kind of values in something that usually, as our current systems has only basically, this is the market value, that's the information you can put in. Now we can decide and consciously decide what kind of values we want to create this kind of infrastructure, currency infrastructure. And then that does not in itself tell us which kind of values we put in, because it can be neoliberal market values that you put in, and you create this, but it's not in the technology. It's basically a social political decision, exactly, how we create this infrastructure.
Yeah, technology is design. That's what people forget, right? So you look at the internet and you could see, okay, it was invented by the army, by non-commissioned officers who wanted to retain independence from centralized command in war. And then the scientists looked at it and said, oh, we can use this to connect science. And then citizens looked at it and said, oh, we can use that to communicate. And then business saw the citizens on it and said, oh, we can sell to them. And then the government looked at it and said, oh, we need to control this. So you have one technology, but it's, historically, it's this layering of particular human interests that make it what it is, and it changes. Like the internet was originally very peer-to-peer, and now it's entirely centralized and with censorious algorithms. So and so the blockchain is the same. So there is a blockchain that is used for Bitcoin and speculative investments, and all kinds of hiding illegal economic transactions. But you can also say, well, let's use these ledgers as an institution of the commons. And so I know it sounds weird, but I think public ledgers are the institution for the commons. It's deciding to put our transactions in the open and say, if we want to, it's saying, you know, we show what we do voluntarily.
Yeah.
Right? And for example, okay, this is, so nowadays we do everything in competition. So we say, even if we want to do good things like decarbonization, we're going to say, okay, let's have a procurement contest, public procurement. And then the best candidate gets the money and everything else is lost. You know, all the other preparations serve for nothing. But you could say, okay, we allow every citizen to decarbonize. And we have a public ledger where you can voluntarily lodge your decarbonization. You get verified, recognized, you get tokens, and then the government can say, well, you know, this is a public priority that we are funding partially. You can also say these positive externalities that we are producing as citizens benefit big institutions and corporations, and they have a vested interest in paying us to do this. You see that thing? So what you're getting, instead of extracting value, taxation, and then redistributing, what you get is a direct financing of generative work. No, it's not a market. I'm not calling this a market, right? You're not selling, but you're recognized for your contributions. And so when you talk about values, well, contributions, we can't measure them right now. We only measure extractive commodities. And impact, we're also not measuring, right? So these are values that are not integrated in the marketplace.
Now, this all makes sense to me, but from a kind of a point of view of a conscious and also social and conscious and collaborative world culture. When we look at the example that you're bringing, the internet, one could also make exactly the argument, you see what happened. There was so much utopian impulse about the peer-to-peer quality of the internet, but the real market and monopolistic power structures are just overpowering the potential. And what really comes out is the opposite, as we see it right now, where one could make the argument that basically this is not even a capitalist world system anymore. It's a digital feudal system that we are starting to live in. Not making the economic argument, but hearing the economic argument. So one could say, yes, it's true. You can put into a digital currency kind of a value system, but what will really drive is the real power structures. Is this not just basically a red herring to see, wow, we have all this commons potential, but what really will come out is a neoliberal complete modification of a global reality where kind of a social, political in the sense of polis, kind of democratic structures, power decisions are completely sidelined because everything is basically built in a new form of blockchain market economy. Isn't that what really is more likely the outcome that we have to look into?
I think it might be in the short term, right? The question is, I don't think that this system, which is systematically overriding planetary boundaries, is an eternal system. So we are actually witnessing the blockage of a system. We are witnessing that this system is not able to solve its fundamental issues. So in that sense, we're going against the wall. And while we go against the wall, we might get more dictatorial and more control. But eventually, is this system going to be able to answer its social, cultural, and ecological needs? And that's, so I think we're in an era of transition, and so in that sense, it's an era of exodus, right? So what you have is, so this is what we talked about in the beginning. We have a massive differentiation, right? So in the 15th century, suddenly you have a printing press, and the Catholic Church can no longer maintain its hold over the knowledge spreading, right? And that leads eventually to the Reformation. Today, the internet has created the same. We have fragmented the field. Everybody is in little groups. Nobody knows how the other people are thinking anymore. We're getting our separate information streams. And this is fraying our ideational glue, right? We have gravity for physics. We have biological fitness for life. And we have ideational glue that holds societies together. And at this moment, that ideational glue is dissolving. And so what is happening at this time is that people are looking for answers outside of the system. So now it looks like chaos, but I think, when we look back, we will say, when this is actually the period where all these new things were being tried out, it's like a Darwinian process of alternatives building, right? And, I did a study about urban commons. So, cooperative housing, co-housing, collective access to organic food. So I did a study in Ghent, and from 2008 to 2016, there was a tenfold increase in urban commoning in Ghent. And then we did studies in Flanders, Holland, Catalonia. There's figures from Italy, where 1 million people are involved in 250 cities around urban commoning. So there's a real explosion of alternatives. It's marginal. Maybe it's 2-3% of the population at this stage, but it is something significant for the future. And that's basically, what I'm hoping. Of course, how fast this is going to go, how much dislocation we'll need before these alternatives become, realistic. So another thing I might share with you is, I'm reading a lot of macro history right now. Mm-hmm. So I've read Spengler, The Decline of the West, which is very interesting to understand what is happening now. I'm reading Toynbee, Study of History. Let me just give you the example of Toynbee, because this is very interesting. So what he says is that whenever civilization, is dissolving, so, the last stage is the universal state. Then when it's dissolving, what you get is a universal church. So he says the internal proletariat, so the common people who are no longer being protected by the state, because the state is losing its capacity to organize solidarity. So, people are slowly but surely organizing themselves to survive. And they do this, through common ideologies, and there used to be these universal religions. So then you have, in the past, he calls it Volkerwandeling. So you had this dislocation of the population, you had these nomadic movements. And, typically a nomadic group would take over the state. They would not have the capacity to manage that country that they took over, like the Frankish in Gaul. And so they would need to connect with the Universal Church, which was the only organization that had the loyalty of the people and then had the capacity to manage a complex society, right? And that then creates the ideology that will serve the next iteration of a civilization. Mm-hmm. So the question is, what is that ideology today? And that's very hard to say. I'm not very popular when saying this, but I'm very anti-identitarianism, right? I think this is one of the regressive ideologies that are emerging in this period. You find it on the right and on the left in different ways, right? But I think the commons is actually a positive way to look at this, right? So, because what is commoning? Commoning is contribution. So let's take permaculture. Okay, so you're feeding a mud. It's very local, very concrete, and you get your food. You do this in a community. So you have recognition and relationships with co-contributors in this project. But everything else, your learning, your certification happens at a translocal level, right? And so this is what I call cosmo-localism. And I think this is a new global order. So now we have two global orders. We have the Western market-driven rentier capitalism, global reset, you know, Western order. And the way I see the global reset is a dream to run the world with global private-public magisterium. So it's run by the banks and the financial sector. They invite in weak states and NGOs. And you know, that's what they're doing. They already created 400 commissions in the WEF, you know, and they deal with domains. And I think that's their idea of global governance. You know, it's like a globe, but it's a global domination by financial capital, essentially, right? Then you have the other side, which is the Russian and the Chinese. And I think that's what Ukraine is about. It's a systemic struggle. And they're sovereignists, right? They don't want the market to rule. They want the state to rule the market. So you can be an oligarch, but only if you listen to the Russian state or to the Chinese state. And of course, they're both different, but what they share is the belief that the state is the core institution. Both of them are rival institutions. Both of them fight for scarce resources. And that leads to war. War between them, but also war between states and competition between corporations. And historically, what we've done is, well, we've done that. We fight, and then the cost is so high that that's when we jump to the other system. So we have the Napoleon Wars, the last 20 years. It's devastating for Europe, and it creates 100 years of peace and a new system of capitalism and the nation state, right? Then we have World War I and World War II. You can consider that as one struggle, one transition period, and it creates a welfare state. And that is what is now collapsing. And so the Cosmo-Local order is a order where we relocalize production, because doing that, we can save 2/3 of matter and energy. This is being calculated. So we spend like 3 times more transporting things than making things. So just by saying, you know, we change the default. Right now we say we trade as much as we can. If we can't find it anywhere else, we'll do it here. And Cosmo-Local is the opposite. It's the subsidiarity of material production. We do it here, and if we can't find it here, we'll look for it somewhere else. So it's a shift. The default position is it doesn't mean 100% localization, but it means smart localization where we can, because it's ecologically logical to do that. Mm-hmm. Okay, then what about collaboration? Well, there's no reason not to collaborate with other people. So if you do permaculture, it's very local, but you learn from permaculturists in the whole world. Mm-hmm. And so this is what I call magisteria of the commons, right? We have markets, states, we have international states, transnational corporations, and finance. What we need is translocal civic commons first as a counterpower. So what you have is, let's say you have distributed production, but then you have a global open design community that, you know, facilitates the innovation at a larger scale, because why not benefit from an innovation somewhere else? And so in terms of ecological transition, this model would allow for an extraordinarily fast transition, because any innovation anywhere in the world would be shared within that community, within that domain, and it would have institutions, trusts that are powerful enough to protect, you know, the planetary boundaries and the resource limitations, right? And there are a lot of interesting initiatives of people that are, you know, thinking and already experimenting with this. So one is called r30.org. And so what they do is they say, okay, let's have a global organization that looks at the negative pivots for every single commodity. So how much copper is there in the world? What's the biocircularity of copper? And what's the negative pivots that we cannot reach? Because if we reach them, then we get this kind of downward spiral. So that allows them then to calculate the usage of copper, the responsible usage of copper. And then, of course, and this is, of course, the whole difficulty is there any mechanism to make agreements around this, right? Because otherwise it doesn't work. And so, but the new regime, the Cosmo-Local regime, would be a regime that would be able to do this. Well, I think at some point we need shifts in power. We need, people to mobilize and but I think the first thing we need to do is to organize bottom up. So so I'll give you an example. So I think now what we need to do is think about ownership. So, this is a famous example. It's the Park Slope Food Co-op. It was started like 40 years ago in Brooklyn. And, they have this model where if you work for 3 hours a month, you become a member of the co-op and you get like 25% discount. So you get high quality organic food at very cheap prices because they don't really have to pay a lot of people because people are volunteering, to work in the shop. Okay. So this has created a worldwide movement of food co-ops everywhere in the world. But the only reason they can stay in Brooklyn is because they own the building, right? They own the building, so they were not subject to gentrification. And so now we have examples. So there is a shared ownership movement in the US, and they've been mapping, all the commons and who owns them. There's a project in the whole of Europe to map food commons, literally map them and know where they are. There is a big project in Holland called Herenboeren, which means, in German would mean like Lord Farmers or something. And they want to buy 64,000 acres by the consumers. And then have an ecological contract with organic farmers. Mm-hmm. They can, because otherwise they can't access land, it's too expensive. Mm-hmm. But this is what we need, a very broad-based commons movement where people start shifting their allegiance from individual consumption to mutualizing their power to survive and and it makes a lot of sense because if you have less money, doing things together is what helps you.
Let me ask two questions to that. As you're kind of laying out your picture of this, let's say, three different options for the future. One, let's call it the cooperative version, the other, the identitarian reactionary version, and the third one, the Cosmo-Local version, as you've just described it. One can see how the cooperative financial capital version has historic power to basically form its own version of the future. You also see how the identitarian nationalist utopia, out of a mixture of, let's say, state interests like Russian state, Chinese state, but also collective psychology, kind of national identity in a over-complex world where you basically want to stay with your local people, so that you can see how this creates an historic dynamic that allows this to be a potential future in contrast to the big capitalist, or however you want to call it. What are the historic forces that are in favor of the third version, of the third option, where you see there is a potential that this is not more than a nice possibility that one can think of, but that has a real option to become history because there are historic forces, maybe economic forces, maybe ecological forces, maybe consciousness forces that are kind of speaking for this being an option for the future?
I wish I knew.
Sorry to ask the question, but that's...
It's a very important question. So, my dream has been that the commoners become a political subject, right? But to be honest, I see very little sign of it. This is what So I spent 10 years, trying to do this, and then also trying to convince the left to have, commons enabling policies, right? But the success rate is like very minimal, very minimal. Mm-hmm. And complication, I think, I think there's a very realistic chance of nationalistic counter-revolutions in the heart of Europe. And to be very realistic about it, right? So what we see now is the left has become the party of the cognitive elites, the urban educated people. Mm-hmm. And in countries like France, the left has 25% of the vote, half of what it used to have. And the biggest opposition party is the Rassemblement National, which, whatever you may think of them, it is factually the working class party today. They have like 75% of the working class vote. They have, if you map it and you look at the Communist Party 30 years ago, it's exactly the same map, right? Mm. Okay, so then you see what is happening in Poland and Hungary, where you have nationalistic movements with solidaristic ideology, right? And they have a nativist policy, and Hungary spends 5% of its GDP to support working class families with children. And guess what? They've been re-elected 4 times. And there's polls showing that workers are the most happy in Poland and Hungary. So it's entirely possible that, this is our future for a while, that as a reaction to neoliberalism, we get this kind of revolt, and people become right-wing and conservative and social. And I think this is quite likely to happen in quite a few countries in Europe. Now you look at the US, the next midterms will be, is predicted to be the largest Republican victory in 80 years. It's going to be a literal wipeout of the Democrats. Will they care about climate change? I don't think so. So you have a really problematic picture. So I think this is part of the deregulation, the dislocation of our societies. And so the way I keep certain optimism is by really looking at the longer term, right? It's like building these seeds, strengthening these seeds, interconnecting these seeds, making sure that we have property, making sure that property is protected. So this is the kind of things that I think we need to think about now. Is to, so it's what the labor movement did in the 19th century, right? It started with insurances, corporate housing co-ops. It created all these organizations at the grassroots, and then they linked with each other. And then they linked to the unions, and they linked to the political party, and they linked to social insurance. And they became a very powerful social force.
There's one element I would like to add,
yeah,
on the optimistic side, and hear what you think about it and its importance. And interesting enough, from my perspective, it's exactly what you're doing. It's the creation of social imaginary. Because part of the situation is that if neither the finance capital solution nor the national solutions will be real solutions for the problem that we have, on one hand, we are in a dilemma. But part of the dilemma is that we don't have the social imaginary of a different future being possible. So the capacity, if I use a kind of a different language here, to dream together, realistic dreams, where something becomes visible that right now is not visible because we only have dystopian futures at this point in our social collective consciousness. The capacity to be able to think about, I don't want to call it utopian, but positive futures. and have the foundations that this is not just a pipe dream, but something that is a real possibility in itself, can also create social movements and a historic dynamic.
I'm doing two things for that. So one is, just observing and collating and making visible what is happening today. Mm-hmm. So in my wiki, wiki.p2pfoundation.net, I have 23,000 articles on real projects. And they have been viewed at least 150 million times. And we published a book just this year called the Cosmo-Local Reader with 40 case studies of Cosmo-Local project, showing that this is a realistic thing. It already works. Of course, there are not 100 million people doing that, but there are 40 thriving Cosmo-Local projects at work that involve hundreds of people. And so we show that this is a real possibility, that this is being done. And this is a real, realistic, a real utopia, if you like, right? So that's the now, right? Then the second thing I'm doing is, and this is new for me, I've done this for the last 2 years because I basically couldn't travel because of COVID. So I've been home. And, instead of being frustrated and I said, okay, I'll do a sabbatical and I'm going to study macro history. And I did that 20 years ago and I did it again this time. So I'm reading the macro historians to look at patterns in the past, because I think that's part of realism too, right? Mm-hmm. And so I came with a conclusion, I call it the pulsation of the commons. And so here's the basic story. Human history is actually a cycle of extractive and regenerative moments. So you have markets and states. They are extractive mechanisms. They're growth and conquest oriented. And they create kingdoms, empires, but they always overuse their territory because they're competing with others. They have to. In order to win, they have to have more than the entities they compete with. So they end up overusing their regional planetary boundaries. Then what happens is they start to decline, and that creates a reaction. And that reaction is actually the commons. So local people, when they're faced with dislocation and hunger and illness and pollution, they recreate commons historically. This is nothing new, right? And then paradoxically, because they're doing well, they create a new surplus that creates the energy for a new cycle of extraction. Mm-hmm. This is agricultural history. And then in capitalism, what they do to escape it is to change the frontiers. So they exhaust one region and they go to another. And we have reached that level now that we have exhausted all the frontiers, right? And what that means is that the pulsation of the commons is actually blocked. And so that what we need to do now is first degrowth. And I don't use that politically because I don't think that's useful. But objectively, we need to use less matter and energy. That's just necessity. And then we need a steady state system. And that's what I was talking about, this system that would allow us to do that. And in a steady state actually means the end of the pulsation of the commons. We actually need permanent global majesty of the commons. We need to stabilize this thing that we've done until now, right? This is extraordinarily difficult and extraordinarily challenging to do that because we've never done it, right? And it's a big question whether we can do it, right? But I think that that then requires a certain belief in humanity, that despite everything, despite our darkness and our greed, and that despite everything, we're not 100% suicidal, and we eventually will do what is necessary to protect life in the long run. As we've done many times at the local level when we needed to, right? So now we need to do this at the global level.
Yeah. It's powerful, and it's powerful on two levels. First, in the way you're describing that this is a cycle that seems to be a pattern that one can see by studying deep economic history.
Yeah.
But it also is powerful in the sense, what I meant before, that by you being able to tell that narrative, that narrative creates something that allows us to find next steps to act. Because in able to find a direction how to respond to this multiple crisis, we need to have narratives that allow us to orient in these complex situations. But what you are giving in that is not the thing itself. It's one piece in constructing narratives that allow us to find collective action in that are not just fear-based, but also not just profit bank logic based. In that, there is at least the potential of a shared communicative form of humanity that we can develop together, and that allows, in a positive sense, to create an utopian spirit where we, in a communicative way, find shared ways together. And I appreciate also you being tentative about this, because there is no reason to be kind of too optimistic at this point. And
because
at the same time,
if you're too idealistic, sorry.
Go ahead.
Yeah, so if you're too idealistic, the danger is real that you'll be demoralized very fast, right? Because before things get better, they may get worse, and so you need to have the stamina to stay on the course and to see the light on the other side of the tunnel, even when you go through the dark tunnel. And I'm sure you're familiar with Viktor Frankl, when he wrote Man in Search of Meaning, which I read in my 20s, but it stayed with me. And I think that he says two interesting things. The first thing he says is that the only people who survived in the camps were the Catholics and the communists. And the reason is because everybody else had a short-term vision. They only saw darkness. And so they couldn't muster the strength to survive. And the communists and the Catholics had two advantages. First is they had a long-term vision of a better society, so they could project themselves after the defeat of the Nazis. They could imagine that and believe that eventually that would happen. And because they believed in it, they could also show solidarity to each other. So they actually had communities that helped each other, and other people were more isolated. And then he said another interesting thing is, I'm not sure if he was a pilot himself, but he said, if you go from A to B with a plane, if you aim for B, you will not get to B because the wind will push you away. So you have to aim for C, and then the wind will push you to B, right? So you always have to aim further than you want, because if you are too limited in your aims, you will not get there. So there's a certain way in which an aim is always exaggerated, but it's exactly the reason why you need it to advance. I don't know if you understand what I'm trying to say.
Very much so.
That's where utopianism then comes in. So utopianism may not be real, literally, but if it creates this engine of optimism, right, then it actually fulfills like a self-fulfilling prophecy to a certain degree.
Thank you very much. As we are also coming to the end of our time here, allow me to use this as the final word. Thank you very much for this conversation.
Thank you, Thomas. Thank you. And thank you for letting me know when it's published. And then I'll spread it in my networks and other material in English. Please feel free to send it to me, and I'll
no, very much so. I just stopped the recording also, and yes, very much so. And I also, as we were talking, because I really appreciate the way you go about this, although you're working on a different sector of, let's say, that we are working, because we are basically, the focus of our work is not even the magazine and the webcast. The focus is a dialogue-based understanding of. I see, fantastic.
I'm also, I do have spiritual concerns.
Yeah.
And I'm looking into sociology. I don't know if you're familiar with sociology.
I heard about it. I'm not familiar with it. Yeah.
It's the feminine phase of creation. It's a Judeo-Christian tradition.
One thing, just as I have you, what we do also is that we run sometimes a longer workshop with our guests in a dialogical format on Zoom, which we call Evolve Live, which are something like 3 hour workshops where people can come and engage with the speaker. And if you're interested, I would propose to our team here to also do one with you, and just do something like a workshop also with people in that sense, if that is something you're interested in.
It's fine for me. Yes, absolutely.
Thank you.
If you're ever interested in an article for your magazine or an interview or something, that
we will definitely
could be interesting to spread the ideas that way as well.
We definitely will do that. I regret that I wasn't thinking about it for the last one, because that would have been perfect. But we will find our match here.
All right. Thank you so much, Thomas. Thank you.
Take care. Have a good day over there.
Yeah. Bye. Bye.